want to start out by saying that no one in this story has clean hands. No one. And so, if I talk about some of the actors in this, it doesn't mean that I think the others have clean hands. I'm just targeting some of them. And I think that part of what is important is that I think it's for the Mozambicans to look at the Mozambican actors, and that's what Carlos Nuno will do partly. And I think it's for those of us who are foreigners to Mozambique to look at our own actors. And I think that's what I want to do. And I want to look at two groups of actors. One is the lenders, and in particular Credit Suisse, which is your bank. But I also want to look at the longer-term background, at 3 decades of donor policy, which was very consciously designed to turn the socialists into neoliberal comprador capitalists, and to argue that the $2 billion debt is, in a sense, the success of that 3 decades of donor policy. Now, but I want to say one thing about the debt in the first place, which is that Mozambique got nothing out of this debt. Now, the picture that you see there is of the fishing boats that Mozambique got, which have hardly ever been used. But if you look very closely, you will notice that they are already rusting. And those boats are sitting in the harbor and they are rusting, and there is a restaurant in the port where you can sit and you can look out at the rusting fishing boats if you want. And so, again, reminder, nobody has clean hands. Mozambique has gained nothing out of this. This is $2 billion out there benefiting a lot of people other than Mozambicans. Now, I want to start, first of all, to talk about how the debt came about. And the man that is most important for this is Iskandar Safa. Oh, we're a bit high. Okay. French-Lebanese businessman into naval, military sorts of things. He proposed the maritime project to Armando Gabuza. I'm blocking my own. Sorry, let me move a little bit. Blocking my own slide. He proposed the maritime project to Armando Gabuza, who was president of Mozambique at the time, and it was he who went to Credit Suisse and said, "Can you arrange a $2 billion loan?" He actually went to Credit Suisse and said, "Can you arrange a $3 billion loan?" But Credit Suisse said, "No, we don't think we can go quite that far." And what's interesting is that all of the money goes back to him, goes back to his company, Privatization. Not $1 went to Mozambique. Now, the entire package, the beginnings of the package were arranged by a gentleman called Andrew Pierce, who was working for Credit Suisse, but in the process went to work for Privatization. We are assured that none of this is illegal, improper, incorrect. Now, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but this was based on the setting up of 3 companies. These are not parastatal companies, as Jürgen said. They are, in fact, private companies. Yeah. These are private companies owned by the state, but they are not parastatal companies. This is quite important in the structuring of this, and they are mostly owned by the security services, SEAS. The loans, in turn, we're dealing with $2 billion in loans. Okay, oops.
Sorry.
Shall I take this off? Is that?
Yeah.
That helps? Okay. These are not, they're divided up into $1.2 billion of syndicated loans and $850 million of a Eurobond. and that will become important later. They were organized entirely by Credit Suisse, and part of the money was then organized as subsidiary loans by VTB, which is a Russian state bank. But Credit Suisse is the main organizer of this. Now, the key point of this is that banks are expected to do what is known as due diligence. They are supposed to have a fiduciary responsibility to say that the loans that they are making are reasonable, that they are for a reasonable purpose, that they're repayable. Now, the key thing here is that Credit Suisse simply didn't do a due diligence on this $2 billion of loans. First of all, they said they were government guaranteed, and the government guarantees were invalid. And secondly, they presented business plans. Business plans were wonderful. They said that Mozambican tuna was going to be so much better than the tuna that the Seychelles was catching from the same water, that the Mozambique could sell its tuna for 5 times as much as the Seychelles. All of the lenders, of course, said, yes, we think this is a great idea. We're sure this company will be profitable because its tuna will be so valuable. They also said this included maritime security, that every boat passing through the Mozambique Channel would pay thousands of dollars per passage to these private companies for providing security. And they said that these companies, these private companies, would, of course, get the security to cover the gas wells and the offshore rigs and so on in the north of Mozambique, despite the fact that no American company has ever allowed security to be done by a company that they didn't control. But Mozambique was going to be the first one. Okay. So Switzerland, Credit Suisse then says to the people that's selling bonds, it says, yes, we've done, this is obviously going to be repaid, this loan. So we can first of all say that there's no due diligence having been done here. Not surprisingly, this triggered a set of scandals. If we go back, actually let me go back quickly 2 slides and look at some dates. The Pro-Indica syndicated loan was February and June 2013. The Ematum bond was August 2013. And the final syndicated loan was May 2014. In November of 2013, which is between these 2 secret loans, the Ematum Eurobonds are public. And so it became public that Mozambique had a bond for $850 million for a fishing fleet that was worth practically nothing. So even the IMF got upset. And the IMF got upset and said, look, you can't do this. And so Mozambique admitted that, okay, $500 million of this loan is for military stuff. So we'll transfer the $500 million onto the state budget, onto the Ministry of Defense. So IMF says, fine, we're happy with that. So August of 2014, they then take a second secret loan, which is a syndicated loan again. This was done by VTB. The problem is they're not paying the Ematum bonds. So finally, in March of 2016, they agreed to nationalize the bonds. Now, Ematum is a private company. So Mozambique says, okay, we'll nationalize these bonds, we'll replace them with state bonds. This went through, everybody was happy with this because the other 1.2 billion was secret. So this kept Mozambique, so far, if you didn't take into account the secret debt, Mozambique was within its debt sustainability threshold, high but acceptable. So, unfortunately for Mozambique, when they published the data on the new bonds, the new bonds from the nationalization, in the footnotes was an amount of the total debt that Mozambique had. And the Wall Street Journal did the sums and said, wait a minute, there's $1.2 billion missing here that's in the footnote that isn't in Mozambique in the IMF's official data. And that was the secret debt. Mozambican ministers had told the IMF, there had been rumors of this, Mozambican ministers had told the IMF, of course, that there was no secret debt. Christine Lagarde personally felt personally offended. She had been lied to by a Mozambican minister. This wasn't the IMF, this was personal. And so the IMF halted its program immediately. A month later, the donors halted all support to direct support to the Mozambican government. Now, I think this, I think this must have caught Gabuza by surprise, because I think he thought he had international approval for these loans. After all, first of all, it came from Credit Suisse, which is a major Swiss bank, wholly arranged by Credit Suisse. Secondly, it had the Russian state bank involved. The Russian state bank wouldn't have made loans to Mozambique without permission of the government. But the third is this photograph. And this is the launch of the tuna boats that you saw rustling in the first picture, which includes the French president, Francois Hollande, the ship owner, Safa, and Gabuza at the Cherbourg shipyard. Now, if I was at a meeting that included the French president publicly, I would figure, okay, this really does have international support. The other reason to think it would have had international support was that Safa has very good links with French security and the French military. So you have to assume that the French security had approved this package. So we think then that Gabuza would have thought this is fine. But the reason he really would have thought this was fine was history. And I want you to think back now 30 years. Now this is hard for some of you because it's before some of you were born, but the rest of this talk is a white beard talk because I'm going to go back and be a historian. And this is back to the end of the Cold War. And it may have been a Cold War for most of us, but it was a hot war in Mozambique. 1 million people died in the war in Mozambique. And that was a proxy war between East and West. It was between capitalism and socialism, and 1 million people died in Mozambique in that proxy war. And the victors in that war felt that their job was to convert the socialists of Mozambique into being capitalists. And they didn't want just ordinary domestic capitalists. They wanted a comprador elite that would do what the international community wanted and that was dependent on the international community. And they wanted neoliberalism, free markets, no role for the state, rapid move to market friendly. And in particular, they wanted that Mozambique not follow the Asian tiger model. The Asian tiger model is very much a state intervention, state linking up with domestic capital to support domestic capital. And so it was very clear that they did not want Mozambique to follow the model of the Asian tigers. Now, the problem for Mozambique is, the problem for the donors, the international community, was that the Mozambican elite was divided. Now at this point, Carlos Nuno will jump in and say this is a simplistic explanation, and yes it is, but I only have 20 minutes. Basically, you had one group of the Mozambican elite who were perfectly happy to accept neoliberal capitalism. They're also very corrupt, and they become corrupted during the war. You had another group that challenged the high-level corruption, but also challenged the World Bank adjustment policies. Much more aligned to the Asian tiger model, much more looking that direction. So the donors and the lenders had to make a choice, which part of the elite did they support? And in a sense the choice was obvious. You supported the corrupt elite because they told the donors what the donors wanted to hear and did what they were told. Now, what I'm going to say over the next 10 minutes may, to those of you who haven't followed it, seem somewhat incredible. Let me say that everything I say in the next 10 minutes is footnoted in 2 Third World Quarterly articles. You can actually go back to all of it. Okay. Now I want to take you, this is really going back 30 years before the dinosaurs went away. The thing that happened in the late 1980s, even before the end of the war, was that the World Bank was promoting privatization, and they wanted companies to be privatized. And over the next decade, about 800 companies were privatized in Mozambique. And the World Bank wanted the small and medium companies to go to the Mozambican elite. This was their way of buying off the Mozambican elite, and to the military, senior military figures. Big companies, of course, they had to go to the transnationals, so that the sugar went to transnational sugar companies and so on. The beer company went to Guinness and whatever. But smaller companies were to go to the Mozambican elite. Now, this continued for at least another decade. 1999, which is a decade later, the World Bank supported the privatization of port management to a company controlled by Gabuza, who was to become president of Mozambique 5 years later. So the World Bank was still pushing this, get companies, get domestic capital that was part of the Mozambican elite to take over. The other thing that they did, and this is 1988-89, the World Bank forced Mozambican banks to use World Bank money to give loans to the people who were taking on these private companies that they knew would never be repaid. So they were effectively giving away money. Now this is probably the most incredible thing in the whole saga. And this comes from a World Bank Operations Evaluation Unit report, which you can find on the web. The World Bank literally forced banks to give loans that they knew would not be repaid, and that the banks themselves complained about. And the officers told that to the Operations Evaluation Unit. Now, what we were doing is converting the socialists to capitalists. Now, if we assume for a moment that the Mozambican elite has no experience of capitalism, that we are training Mozambicans to be capitalists, what were we teaching them? First of all, we were teaching them that companies are given to you and that you get loans that you don't need to be repaid. And we weren't teaching them anything about hard work, business plans, markets, that sort of thing. The second thing was we were teaching them the business is about political connections and what the state and the donors will give you. So that's the model of capitalism that we introduced to Mozambique. Now, the other thing that was happening at about the same time was strengthening the dependence on the donors and the lenders. So one of the things that happened in the early 1990s was the IMF pushed down the minimum wage. And it pushed down the minimum wage to the point where nurses and teachers were below the domestic poverty line. Now that had two impacts. The obvious immediate impact was it normalized petty corruption. Anyone who went to a nurse had to have money to pay. You know, a woman going to give birth had to have some money wrapped up in her capellana to give to the nurse if she wanted support. And this was normalized because the nurses were saying, look, I have a family to feed too. And so petty corruption became the norm very quickly. The second thing was that the embassies and the aid agencies were hiring Mozambicans. So you had senior level Mozambicans moving over to embassies to be secretaries, to be low-level officials, or they were hiring their relatives, or they were giving top-ups, or they were, yeah, okay. So, but the point was that they were only hiring those people who supported the donor line. Those who didn't support the donor line, of course, didn't get the top-ups, didn't get the jobs. So again, we created a kind of dependence. Now we go into the mid-1990s. What do we get in the mid-1990s? One of the things that begins to happen around 1995 is that preventing support, direct state support for domestic capital, but allowing it for foreign capital. so that the transnational corporations who were taking over the sugar plantations said they needed to be protected. And they got special protection. The Mozambique rice producers were not allowed protection. State forced the cashew industry to close because it was protected. No free market for tobacco. Okay. But the critical thing for what goes on now is privatizing the banks. And the 1995-98, the IMF and the World Bank worked together to force the privatization of two state banks. And Adriano Malian, who is now finance minister but was at the time governor of Bank of Mozambique, actually went to the IMF at one point personally and said, look, I think we have support from Caixa Geral in Portugal, which is a state bank in Portugal, to take over one of these banks. Will you give me an extra 6 months on this privatization? And the IMF response was very clear, no. We would rather have a corrupt privatization now than the privatization later. Very explicit. Now, the banks, as Malian predicted, of course, the only people who would take these banks were a bunch of crooks, several of them Frelimo crooks, Malaysian crooks, others Portuguese crooks. The banks were looted for about $400 million, at least. There were two assassinations. Siba Mkwakwa, who was the head of banking supervision in Mozambique, was working on Banco Austral and was thrown down the stairwell of a 15-story building. Carlos Cardozo, investigative journalist, was gunned down on the street, both of them investigating. So what happened? 2 months later, there is a donor consultative group meeting. This is 2 months after Siba was thrown down the stairwell, actually the light well, tall building. Donor consultative group meeting in October 2001. Mozambique had asked for $600 million in aid. The donors said, no, you haven't asked for enough, you should get $722 million in aid. Sergio Vieira, who was a former security minister, part of the Frelimo elite, somewhat controversial, wrote in the Sunday newspaper that the pledge of more money than Mozambique asked for showed the international community recognized the good performance of the government and that this overrides the bank scandal and the assassinations of Siba Mkwakwa and Carlos Cardozo. All right, 2001. We are in a position where the international community is with cash on the table saying you are allowed to kill and steal. This is what the Mozambican elite is being told. Now, I think Sergio Vieira was right, clearly. Good performance is accepting neoliberal capitalism. If you look at the Monterrey conference that took place just 6 months later, Mozambique was just one of 2 countries that were considered a good performer in Africa. Quite important, May 2002, civil society in Mozambique was really getting upset with this. I mean, they were especially upset about Siba and Carlos Cardozo. So they had a closed meeting with the donors, saying to the donors, please do something about corruption. And the donors explicitly said no. The World Bank, Norway, and the British government all made public statements saying corruption was not a priority for them. Okay, now the people who had looted Banco Austral of several $100 million were published, were known. We know who killed Siba, senior Frelimo figure. There were no prosecutions. The donors never said a peep. So we really can get away with killing and stealing. And that's, at this point also, it became obvious and was published that Mozambique was a major heroin transit center, and the heroin transit traffic of several $100 million a year was being controlled by the Frelimo elite, and the donors said, that's okay with us too. So, Frelimo elite can kill, they can steal, they can deal drugs. Who's going to object? It's a good life. Okay, that was 2001, 2002. What's happened since then? Well, Gabuza was elected president in 2004. So remember, Gabuza becomes president out of that background. 2007, Vodacom is a major that takes over invests, becomes the second mobile telephone company that gives shares to Gabuza, to Graça Machel, to Frelimo. And everybody applauds and says, yeah, that's the way to do it. 2007, Val agrees the coal mine deal. They set up a slush fund of $120 million, which is based in a New York bank. And the IMF says that's fine. 2010, Universal Corporation, which is the major tobacco company in Mozambique, pleads guilty to bribing a Mozambique governor to get their exclusive contract in TET. Nobody says that Universal should lose its contract. Nobody says the governor should be prosecuted. 2010 we get gas. 2013 we have the debt. So, in a sense, this is the kind of history. Now, if you look at Gabuza personally, 1990s, of course, he's given companies along with everybody else. 1999, the World Bank gives him the port contract. 2001, the donors say that you can steal and kill and trade drugs. 2004, he's elected president. 2007, he gets the Vodacom shares, and everybody thinks this is great. 2010, the gas. 2013, Credit Suisse comes to him with this VTB loan, this loan proposal. VTB joins in, Francois Hanlon. So it seems a perfectly reasonable deal. And I think what's interesting is that, of course, in 2013, oil and gas prices were very high. I think if the oil prices hadn't fallen and the commodity prices hadn't fallen, he would have totally gotten away with it. Nobody would have bothered. Nobody would have cared. So, where are we? I think the donors, I think the $2 billion should be seen as a mark of success of donor policy. The donors have what they want. They have a resource economy controlled by the TNCs. They have neoliberalism, a free market, a weak state, and they have a comprador elite that depends on the donors and mostly does what they want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe, for this very to the point speech. Really gets to the point about recent Mozambican history and the process. The way you see it, the process that led to this quite desperate situation in which Mozambique is at the moment. So, yes, I'm sure there are lots of issues for questions.
There's a discussant actually.
Thank you very much, Joe, for a very interesting presentation. I'm actually torn. I don't know if you were talking about the cynicism of donors or if you were being cynical yourself. And I'll try to sort that out now in my summary. I think you have a compelling claim, and the claim which you are making is actually that this debt crisis is actually shows the success of the commitment towards transforming former socialists into neoliberals or into capitalists, and you draw that conclusion from looking at the policies which have been put in place in Mozambique over the past 30 years, which have centered, according to you, on creating and supporting and fostering a comprador elite which can actually get away with anything so long as it shows its commitment to neo-liberalism. Now, I think this is a compelling story, and it does help some of us to make sense of of this extremely difficult to understand case of the secret debt, which, of course, according to you, is not secret at all. Was not secret at all. It was known to the major players, and apparently those people in Mozambique who engaged in it actually did that under the assumption that they were operating out in the open. I have a few issues, however, with your account, with your compelling account, and this is where I come to the point where I wonder if the donors are cynical or if the account is cynical. I think the first issue, which is a very general one, is the suggestion, which might make sense, but it is the suggestion that you have on both sides people who are operating with a common purpose. So you have the donors who are somehow committed to something which is very clear to all of them. They know what needs to be done so that they can reach those goals. And on the other side, you have the crooks who are crooks already, and you know, like every crook in the world, they know how to take advantage of situations, and they actually operate on that basis. I think, you know, this is a very interesting way of looking at it, but the moment we make the assumption that we are dealing with institutions that operate in such a single-minded way, I think we start missing out on things that we may need to consider. So I don't think that it is the case at all times that there is, if you like, a convergence of interest on the part of donors of the International Monetary Fund, for example, and the World Bank. I think there were times when they were actually in conflict, right? Even in terms of what they should do in Mozambique itself, right? So I think we need to take that into account. I think we need to take into account also the extent to which some donor countries respond to popular pressure in their own country, which may lead them to look at different ways of supporting development policy and so on. I mean, if we start thinking about these things in this way on the part of the external actors, and then we also look at the internal actors who, of course, are not also that, you know, we cannot really describe them as a group with a common purpose operating under the same logic. Also, particularly because the circumstances under which they operate may also tend to respond to very particular openings that are given to them by certain situations. So my point is this: if we take this into account, then I think that this very neat and very compelling and also plausible narrative of a whole process of transforming people into some kind of capitalist, it begins to show some cracks, and then it requires us to actually ask further questions, which I hope other people here will ask. So that's my first point. The second point is also very important to me, and maybe this will not meet with the approval of some people due to their own political commitments here. But there is a very negative, or there is a privileging of a negative description of capitalism or of free market economics or of neoliberalism. So, you know, this system is only itself when it fosters this kind of behavior, right? Now, from a certain political perspective, one can buy into that, definitely. I mean, if we are very cynical about free market economics, then we can really make the assumption that whatever they do is going to be bad, right? You know, they are friends of crooks and so on and so on. But if we don't buy into that perspective, then we have a problem. I mean, we need to explain what the particular circumstances were that actually turned the whole development policy setup into supporting crooks, right? And I don't think that it is in the nature of neoliberalism, not even of neoliberalism, to support crooks. So I think we need to discuss that issue as well. There's a third point here, and I know you didn't mean it in this sense, but I need to raise it because the way you portray these Mozambicans who are, you know, being coached and trained into being bad people, it's almost like, you know, these people don't take decisions for themselves, and these people are not committed to certain things which are good. Of course, this narrative is helpful to those of us who want actually to understand why bad decisions were taken, or decisions which turned out to be bad, or decisions that have bad consequences. But I think it is fair, and we should be fair to countries like Mozambique, and we should be fair to the individuals involved. That, you know, we also try from time to time to make the assumption that these people may have thought that they were doing the right thing, right? And if that is the case, you know, what went wrong then? I mean, we heard in the first presentation here how constraining the whole environment is. And how limited the scope is for governments in developing countries to take the right decisions. I mean, the right decisions from the perspective of most of us here. So I think even in the case of Mozambique, we still need to make the effort to perhaps make the assumption that there may have been some kind of commitment to something good. What was that, and why was that thing undermined, and why did people not remain true to it? Why did people not live up to their own standards? You know, we don't have to believe that that was the case, but I think that making that assumption might be useful. So in this respect, I actually do think, and I think I'm the only one at home who thinks so, and I'm fine with that because I'm not there. You know, I do think there was a genuine commitment to doing something which is good for the country, right? I think that commitment was there, and I actually see I see the person who was mainly involved in this as a tragic figure, someone who unleashed things he was not able to control, and there was hubris in all of that. He thought he was more powerful than he was, and then all of these things happening within a context that is highly intolerant to different ways of thinking, right? Such that you have a highly ideological or patriotic narrative which is used to fend off any kind of criticism. So I'm sure that there may have been people within the very closed group that was involved in these dealings that may have been saying to him, look, this might not be a good thing, and that those people may have been told that they were being anti-patriotic and so on. So I think we need to take this, all of these things into account. I'm not saying we should agree with